Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. 3 years ago, I looked at A Study in Scarlet, the first story to feature the master detective himself, Sherlock Holmes. Today, as you can see, we're going to be solving a most devious mystery. The incredible mystery of why I haven't reviewed another Sherlock Holmes story since then. The answer, my friends, is quite simple. I've been busy. But the wait hasn't been in vain, because I've had the time to think, and I realized something, that if I'm going to do a detective story, I need something, or rather someone else. Every great detective has a partner. Batman has Robin, Sean Spencer has Gus, Eddie Valiant has Roger Rabbit, and of course, Holmes has Watson. As such, I've enlisted the help of a brilliant reviewer and resident Sherlock Holmes expert to be my Watson on this case. Please help me welcome to the show, Kate Cast.
Hey Michael, happy to be here. Always thrilled to talk about Sherlock Holmes. One question though, why am I Watson?
What do you mean?
Like you said, I am the Sherlock Holmes fanatic here. I should be in Holmes' place. Just saying.
Well, it's my channel. And besides, I already have the hat, so I get dibs on Holmes.
That is not fair, man.
Hey, aren't you the one who's always saying that Watson is a clever and accomplished man in his own right? That he deserves more respect?
You know what? You're right. I would be proud to join you on this review as your Watson. What now, my dear Holmes?
Elementary, my friend. Since the last Holmes story I covered was the first one, it stands to reason that the second one I should cover should be the second one written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Thusly, today we'll be covering The Sign of the Four, released in 1890, 3 years after A Study in Scarlet.
Fun fact, Conan Doyle was commissioned to write what would later be known simply as The Sign of Four at a dinner party that Oscar Wilde attended, not long before he wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray. Much like its predecessor, A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four was only moderately successful. It did fine, but the great detective wouldn't become a household name until the short stories began being published afterwards in the Strand magazine.
If you want the backstory on Conan Doyle, go check out my last Holmes review. And I think that's about all we need to know, so let's start the investigation of a most curious case featuring missing treasure, men with wooden legs, and the introduction of an iconic Holmes character. This is The Sign of the Four. The cover is interesting, although namely because it's missing a pretty major element that you think it would have. The cover features two people on it, Watson and Mary Morstan. Can't help but think that someone important is missing.
Yes, in his own story, Sherlock Holmes is nowhere to be seen on the original cover. The illustration is a great one to represent the story, but it is pretty amusing to realize it doesn't include the great Sherlock Holmes. Like we said, Holmes wasn't a household name yet, so he wasn't the icon he would become for the cover of a book. Trust me, most reprints would correct this.
Though it does sort of make sense if you look at it through the lens of the canon, where Holmes is content to give credit to others, and since Watson is the chronicler, he'd be the main character. Wait a minute, does that make Holmes Watson's sidekick? Take the hat, I want to switch.
No takesies backsies.
Well, it was worth a shot. Anyway, let's get to the story itself. The story opens with Sherlock Holmes injecting himself with cocaine. You know, there are lots of ways to open a mystery story, and I admit this wouldn't be my first choice.
Perhaps not, but it comes with something very common. Dr. Watson's objection at his friend's unhealthy habits. When you read the doctor's question, which is it today, morphine or cocaine, you can just feel the disapproval behind it.
There's a little bit of recap to explain to any new readers what the deal is with Holmes, him being the world's only unofficial consulting detective, and makes reference to the Jefferson Hope case from A Study in Scarlet.
which Watson has since written up in-universe. Holmes is quite critical of his writing, though, and Watson gets very annoyed at the detective's dismissive remarks towards something that was specifically designed to please him. Something that I'm sure everyone who's had to write for Sherlock Holmes since Sir Arthur Conan Doyle can relate to.
Holmes also takes the opportunity to show off a little and do some deducing, also introducing one of Holmes' more notable quotables. "Eliminate all other factors, and the one which remains must be the truth." Particularly noteworthy to me due to its inclusion in 2 different Star Trek movies.
An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Are you actually suggesting they're from the future?
If you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Didn't Data also quote that line?
Once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
To further remind the audience of just who Sherlock Holmes is and what he does, Watson puts him up to a challenge involving a family heirloom, a watch. Holmes almost immediately deduces that the watch belonged to Watson's older alcoholic brother, who had financial troubles and recently died. Watson calls him out, sure that Holmes had made inquiries about Watson's brother just for the purposes of showing off, but Holmes simply states that he got the brother part from the fact that the initials on the watch are that of Watson's father, and the older brother would typically get the family name, the financial troubles from the fact that the watch has markings that indicated it was pawned several times, and the alcoholism from the fact that there are scratches around the keyhole that indicate an unsteady alcohol-induced hand.
Ah, the watch scene. This has become probably the most famous moment involving Holmes' powers of observation. It displays how he can attach meaning and events to the smallest of details, to the point that, as you said, Watson doesn't believe he could have possibly gotten his brother's entire tragic history from a pocket watch. But Holmes assures him that that was all the information he had, and it was all he needed. It does such a great job at demonstrating Holmes' unique powers of deduction that most high-profile adaptations will get to doing a version of the watch scene eventually, which makes sense. I mean, who else but Sherlock Holmes could deduce alcoholism from some scratches?
Now that you mention it, did anyone else find it kind of strange the way that BBC Sherlock modernized this moment? If you're one of the lucky few to have not been on Tumblr over the last decade, the BBC Sherlock replaces the watch with a smartphone, and keyhole scratches with marks around the charging port, which, while similar, doesn't quite track for me, since it's very common to miss the port for other non-alcohol related reasons. I can't speak to whether or not the watch key makes more sense, since I don't have experience winding watches, but I find it more believable.
I mean, I didn't really have a problem with it. It always added up to me. Those were some pretty strong scratches on that phone. But what do I know? I'm not the detective here. Though I did do a year-long dedicated retrospective to this particular adaptation.
Mild nitpicking of Stephen Moffat's writing aside, their discussion is tabled, however, when Mrs. Hudson presents a young woman named Mary Morstan, who has a case for Holmes. You see, Mary's father went missing a decade earlier under very suspicious circumstances, right after requesting that Mary join him in London.
But that's not the strange part. The strange part is that 4 years later, an ad appeared in the paper asking for Mary's address, so she provided it. In return, she received an unmarked parcel with nothing but a large, very valuable pearl inside. Not even a note. After that, Mary receives a similar package with a similar pearl inside on the same day every year for the next 6 years. Wow, times really have changed. You give a complete stranger your address, you get jewelry. That would probably not be the case nowadays. Don't do that.
But this year is different because she also received a letter requesting her presence outside a theater that night, informs her that she's a wronged woman who deserves justice, and like a good Tinder date, says that she can bring friends along to make sure she feels comfortable, as long as they aren't police, hence why she went to Holmes, who naturally agrees to tag along, and offers Watson's presence as well, although given what Watson says after Mary leaves, he probably would have come along anyway. It's also a good time to note that while Watson remarks that Mary is a very attractive woman, Holmes says that he doesn't notice.
You can debate Holmes' sexuality all you want, and it's a debate none of us will ever win, but comments like that are why I firmly put him in the asexuality camp. Attractiveness is not something on his radar, and it doesn't make him an automaton like Watson says, just focus on other things. I appreciate that. It's certainly a fair mindset to have in this case, because despite Watson's constant pining for Mary, there's some more important stuff going on right now, as we'll soon see once they meet Miss Morrison's mysterious correspondent. Along the way, Mary Mary mentions to Holmes she found a mysterious piece of paper with her father's things, with the only words on it reading, "The Sign of Four."
He said it! He said it!
When they arrive at the theater, they're quickly whisked away in a coach, and Holmes plays GPS, notating their trajectory until they're delivered to one of the only inhabited houses in a questionable neighborhood and directed inside. The man behind all of this, Thaddeus Sholto, is the son of Major Sholto, the only man Mary's father knew in London when he disappeared, and a man whose hairstyle is somehow even sillier looking than Fraser Crane's skullet. After introductions are made and Sholto gets sidetracked by asking Watson a pressing medical question regarding Sholto's heart, he reveals that indeed Mary's father is dead, and after some more sidetracking, finally gets to telling the story about what happened. Geez, it takes this guy so long to get to the point, I feel like I'm watching an episode of The Literary Lair.
Don't be silly. His recounting doesn't come with as many jokes. Anyway, long story short, Major Sholto returned from the service with a decent amount of treasure and a lot of paranoia, being very nervous around people, particularly ones with wooden legs. The fear eventually led him to his deathbed. In his last days, he told his sons about what he did to Captain Morrison and how they can atone for his mistakes. Turns out he brought much more treasure home than originally believed, and on that fateful day when Morrison returned to London, he arrived at Sholto's house and they had a heated argument over dividing the treasure. The stress and anger caused the captain's heart to give out, and he died. Since he hit his head in the fall, Sholto was worried people would think he killed him, so he buried the body himself to dispose of the incident.
To be completely honest, I'm not even sure I believe that story. That a man in Victorian London had a weak constitution? Totally. But the story is very suspect. If I was his lawyer, I would advise him to take whatever plea deal they give him, because no judge would buy that.
Oh, come on, I think you're being harsh. I mean, what reason has this man given us to not believe him? All he did is steal valuable treasure from another country, betray everyone involved and hoard it for himself, denied his friend a proper burial after allegedly not killing him, keeping his daughter in the dark about his fate, and kept this all to himself and didn't even attempt to atone for any of it until it drove him to his grave. Actually, you might have a point. Sholto's kind of an asshole.
But before Major Sholto revealed the location of the treasure, a ghost interrupted the proceedings. Well, not really, but he might as well have been given how fast he got in and out of the premises, vanished without a trace, and then came back to rifle through Major Sholto's things during the night without stealing anything. And he also scared Sholto to death, so there's 2 checks in the ghost column.
However, the burglar left a note behind the scene, a note that only read, "The Sign of Four."
Thaddeus explains that he and his brother never found the treasure, but he had a small sampling of it that their father had left out, and while his brother kept their father's opinion of keeping it a secret, Thaddeus felt that Mary shouldn't be left destitute without her father, hence the gifted pearls every year. As if all of this wasn't enough for Mary to come to terms with, her father's death, a secret treasure, Thaddeus informs her that his brother finally located the whole treasure, and since part of it was owned by Mary's father, he wanted her to join him in confronting his brother to get their shares. And given what a late night it's been so far, everyone is eager to get it over with as quickly as possible.
Say, that's what it's like watching one of my videos.
I would say that it also has fewer jokes, but Watson actually has some pretty good time riffing on Thaddeus' hypochondria. They arrive at Pondicherry Lodge, and Thaddeus brings them inside, although the servant doesn't want to let Mary, Watson, and Holmes inside since they're strangers, but coincidentally, Holmes happens to know the servant from his boxing days, so that's a good enough endorsement.
See? Sherlock Holmes being an action hero isn't that weird. He may be as thin as a rake, but he can take on a professional fighter, no problem. However, even if this past encounter gets the whole group inside, there's something amiss at Pondicherry Lodge. The maid is in hysterics when they enter because Bartholomew has been locked in his room since Thaddeus left last night. Holmes and Watson investigate, peeking through the keyhole as best they can, only to find a blank, distorted, frozen face staring at them on the other side with, as Watson describes, a ghastly, horrible smile.
Well, they say Sherlock Holmes is the world's greatest detective. It was only a matter of time before the Joker showed up.
If only it were that simple. However, when they force the door open, they find not the clown prince of crime, but Bartholomew Sholto dead, and the treasure the brothers recovered gone. All the culprit left behind was a piece of paper, once again inscribed, "The Sign of Four." As an aside, I find it kinda hilarious that Holmes and Watson immediately jump into detective mode and get so wrapped up in the case in front of them, they completely forget that the victim's twin brother is with them.
Holmes discovers that the murder weapon was a poisoned thorn, which means that Bartholomew was killed by either an evil flower or Leela from Doctor Who.
Personally, I'd hope for the evil flower. Then maybe we'll get a musical number out of this.
No shit, Sherlock.
Now that there's a current murder and hysterical servants, a call to the police is in order, and Holmes decides to work his magic in the meantime. Now, I know I don't usually read off direct quotes, but the only way that I can make fun of this, and let me remind you, this is the first thing in the chapter, is if you hear it the same way that I did when I read it for the first time. And since I have another voice on hand, we can do a dramatic reading.
Now, Watson, said Holmes, rubbing his hands, we have half an hour to ourselves, let us make good use of it. My case is, as I have told you, almost complete, but we must not err on the side of overconfidence. Simple as the case seems now, there may be something deeper underlying it.
Simple, I ejaculated.
Oh, grow up. That's the terminology they used at the time. It means to suddenly say or shout something.
I know it's juvenile, but also extremely funny. But it's Arthur Conan Doyle's fault for having that verb be immediately followed on the next page by "his hands were far from horny." As they search for clues, they find a footprint and the mark of a wooden leg, which tracks with Major Sholto's paranoia, and evidence that the wooden-legged man had a friend, and after finding the secret treasure room, they find that the friend was extremely small, as evidenced by a tiny footprint left behind.
Those are some pretty solid clues in a really well put together investigation scene. The good news is that one of them left behind a small trace of creosote, that's a type of oil, with their scent on it. With the help of a very special character we'll get to in a second, it might just lead them to the killers. The bad news is that this excellent investigation is stopped in its tracks by everyone's least favorite Scotland Yard representative to cross paths with our consoling detective, Athelney Jones. He's kind of the worst. It's no wonder he never shows up in a story again.
If his character could be summed up in just one sentence, it would be,
amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
He bursts onto the scene and immediately starts making wild deductions that ignore obvious evidence and invent impossible scenarios.
You know, for someone who doesn't like theorizing, Jones seems to do a lot of it. To paraphrase Holmes in another story, he's twisting facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts.
Not to harp on him too much, but as the Doctor once said, that behavior is common to the very powerful and the very stupid. I'll give you 3 guesses as to which of those Jones is, and the first 2 don't count. He arrests Thaddeus, but Holmes already has a lead on a Mr. Jonathan Small. Ironically, the wooden-legged man and not the short accomplice. Watson decides to bring Mary home for the night while Holmes interviews the servants, and on the way back, Holmes asks Watson to pick up Toby, a dog that can track scents. And I don't even have to finish the story. It's got a dog in it, so that's already 10 out of 10 in my book.
Couldn't agree more. Fans of The Great Detective have a real soft spot for Toby, and can you blame them? Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are already a great pair, but you throw this mud of a tracker into the mix, and it makes the whole case so much better. It's really a shame Toby never appears again, but he certainly left his mark.
During Watson's travels, he agonizes about his feelings for Mary, since compounding the fact that it's simply not the time to pursue a romantic relationship, given the night she's had. For Watson, the time may never come, given her impending inheritance from the treasure once it's recovered, since it would make Watson look like a gold digger. Mary is left in the hands of Mrs. Cecil Forrester, and Watson goes to collect Toby, where once again the mention of Sherlock Holmes's name literally opens doors, and Watson is fast on his way back. Upon his return, he finds that Athelney Jones also arrested the prizefighter, the gatekeeper, and the housekeeper.
That's one thing you could say about Jones. He's definitely eager. Is that the right word? Well, even if Jones thinks he's the one in charge here, Holmes has not been idle. While waiting for Watson, he took a closer look at the footprints left by the smaller accomplice, discovering some misshapen toes, and tried to recreate the method they used to get in and out, climbing all across the roof and making his way down the house by a water pipe. On the way down, he finds a pouch containing more poisonous thorns shaped into darts, just like the one used to kill Bartholomew. This is one of the many ways that makes the methods of Sherlock Holmes unique. He really gets in the footsteps of the criminal. With Toby now aiding him in that task like the good boy he is, they find more evidence of where the wooden-legged man entered the property when they reach the wall.
After ensuring that Watson can withstand a night of walking, Holmes uses the recovered creosote handkerchief to set Toby off on the scent. As they walk, they follow Small's path, and Holmes explains the parts of the case he's figured out. That Jonathan Small is a white, wooden-legged man and a convict. Sholto and Morstan came into contact with Small, who knew of a treasure, while Small was incarcerated, and Sholto stole the treasure out from under his nose. The paranoia was then a result of learning that Small had escaped, and no doubt was after revenge. Then, of course, Small finally shows up, but right when Sholto dies, so he has to come back later to try to find the treasure himself, all the while leaving the sign of the Four so that all the other conspirators know the cost of crossing him. Then he brings a nimble associate with him once he finds where the treasure is hidden, but that associate killed Bartholomew against Small's wishes. Then they escape with the loot.
This is told to Watson, and by extension us, while Toby drags our heroes over a good amount of London through the rest of the night and well into the morning. Toby follows the path with pure determination, only with one moment of confusion before picking up the scent again, racing to the docks to his target, which turns out to be a barrel and cart coated in creosote. Well, I suppose not every dog has its day, but we still love you, Toby. And at least Holmes and Watson get a good laugh out of it. After they compose themselves, Holmes figures out what happened. That one moment where Toby hesitated is where the scent went in two different directions. Toby just took the wrong one. Correcting their course, they end up at another dead end, this time because the culprits presumably took a boat and sailed off from that dock. They head to the lodging of the boat renter, and thanks to Holmes's clever and somewhat cunning approach to conversing with the renter's wife, she tells them that Small and his accomplice took off in the middle of the night with her husband and eldest son to guide them on the steam launch boat Aurora. So now they know what they need to look for to catch their men and get the treasure back. They just have to find it.
With the night's excitement done for the moment, Holmes and Watson return home with Toby in tow, and Sherlock puts out a request for help from the Baker Street irregulars, who assisted during the Jefferson Hope case in A Study in Scarlet, sending them to track down the Aurora. During their rest, Watson continues to agonize over how helping Mary in solving the case will make it impossible for him to act upon his romantic intentions, and Holmes and Watson have a good laugh over the report in the paper of Anthony Jones's investigation.
I don't blame them. Trained and experienced faculties, well-known technical knowledge, and powers of minute observation. If I didn't know any better, I'd swear he wrote this himself. And Holmes says Watson exaggerates in his chronicles.
Holmes manages to triangulate the most likely location of origin for Small's companion, an archipelago off the coast of Myanmar. Watson decides to go check on Mary and give her an update on the case, although Holmes warns Watson not to divulge too much since, and I quote, "women are never to be entirely trusted." And when he returns, he finds Mrs. Hudson in a tizzy because Holmes began acting erratic and locked himself up in his room. And all she did was ask him to clean up his toys.
The unease at Baker Street only grows from there. Holmes is restless. He's so close to solving this case, but the one major piece of the puzzle he needs is eluding him. He's pacing for hours. 2 nights go by without him sleeping a wink because his mind is racing, seeking to find that last answer that is evading his grasp, despite sending pretty much everyone he knows to search for this boat. Finally, Holmes decides to take matters into his own hands and asks Watson to stay behind, which, while he agrees, concerns his friend. He wonders briefly if Holmes has gone so far down the hole of speculation, he made this case into something far more fantastical than it actually is. But he's seen everything Holmes has, and followed the detective's reasoning well. So his worries disappear as quickly as they came to him. You can always count on Dr. Watson to have faith in Sherlock Holmes.
As Watson sits around, he spots an ad in the paper left by Holmes for information regarding Mordecai Smith and his Aurora, but when someone comes to the door, it isn't someone with information. It's Anthony Jones. Yay! Although he's a lot more humble this time around, since his original theory sank faster than a Titanic made of lead.
Wow, who'd have guessed he had such great technical knowledge?
He was invited by Holmes to be part of the finale since Holmes claims to be on the trail of the baddies. But before Holmes returns home, an old seafarer shows up to the door and demands to see Holmes, saying he has information, but he'll only tell Sherlock. He tries to leave, but Jones stops him and Watson invites them in to wait around. Watson and Jones go back to their discussion, only to be surprised by hearing Holmes's voice. And when they turn around, the old man has vanished, leaving Holmes in his place.
Like so much about the story, this is an entrance that is classic Sherlock Holmes. The great detective returns to his flat not just with some theatrics, but in much higher spirits than when he left. He tells Jones that tonight he can lead him to Small and his accomplice for an arrest, on 3 conditions. Acquiring a police boat to aid in the capture, for Watson to deliver the treasure to Mary so she may be the first to open the box as the rightful heiress, and to allow Holmes an unofficial interview with Small after he's captured so he can get all the details of the strange affair. Since Jones has had a large slice of humble pie since we last saw him, he agrees, and thus the game is afoot. Actually, Holmes wouldn't say that for a few more stories, but whatever.
They modify the boat so it's unmarked, and Watson brings alongside his trusty service revolver, and they're off. During the trip, Holmes reveals that he's figured out that Small had the Aurora modified and hidden until it was time to make their big escape. He also found Mordecai Smith, flushed with cash and liquor. Then he stationed one of his Robins to watch the modified Aurora and with a handkerchief when they leave so they can begin the chase. The Aurora is fast, but Holmes is determined to catch up, and orders the ship to go to Warp 9, forcing Scotty to give it all she's got.
I think you're crossing franchises here, man.
According to Spock, Holmes is his ancestor, so maybe not. The chase is on. We now return to BlackScarabFilm's Wide World of Sports. The chase is very fraught, with Aurora gaining a heavy lead thanks to a hazard on the field. The heroes continue their pursuit down the Thames, and they're in the home stretch. It's the Aurora, it's our heroes, it's the Aurora, it's our heroes. But oh wait, Small's accomplice has pulled out his poison darts. That's not a legal move. Watson, quick with the pistol, fires with an assist from Holmes, and he's over the edge, and he's down for the count. And the race is over. In a photo finish, our heroes catch up and force them to stop as the Aurora runs up on a mud bank. Looks like Small has found himself in quite a sticky situation. That wooden leg just sank right into the mud. What a victory! In all my years of broadcasting, I've never seen anything quite like this. Holmes wins the pennant! Holmes wins the pennant!
As you can see, it's a pretty exciting chase to catch the criminals our heroes have been hunting this whole story, even if part of it is described in the longest brick of a paragraph I've ever seen in my life. Look at this. This is a crime. At the end of this race down the Thames, our heroes manage to secure Small, the boat, and the treasure chest. While in custody, Jonathan Small confirms that his Small accomplice, now named Tonga, killed Bartholomew on his own before he even made it into the house. Small greatly disapproved of it, as his anger was with the Major, not his children. He also clarifies that Mr. Smith and his son knew nothing about why he needed the boat or what he was up to. Despite all the twisted events he's found himself a part of, he doesn't want people wrongly accused of being accomplices. Everyone who's been involved with the Agra treasure has met a grim fate. This is where that ends. While Holmes and Jones haul the guilty party back to Baker Street for his promised interview, Watson, accompanied by an inspector, takes the treasure chest over to Mrs. Forrester so Mary can claim what's hers. Watson isn't that excited to give it to her, since in his eyes it'll make her out of his league, and it seems like Mary isn't that enthusiastic to receive it. But it's the moment of truth. Small threw the key to the chest in the river when he was being pursued, so Watson has to pry it open. When they get it open, they discover the box is empty. Not a trace of gold or jewels inside. The Agra treasure is gone forever. But the pair don't seem that broken up about it. Without the treasure coming between them, Watson confesses his love for Mary right then and there, and Mary returns his affections, breaking the hearts of shippers for over a century. Well, that was fast. They got engaged to be married in, 3 days?
Maybe the real treasure was the friends they made along the way.
Boo.
And much like A Study in Scarlet, the final chapter of the story details the backstory of our antagonist, Jonathan Small, beginning when Watson returns with the empty chest to Baker Street to Jones's disappointment. Small tells him that he tossed the treasure overboard because no living man has any right to the treasure except him, and where he's going, it'll be of no use to him. Besides, it's caused everyone involved nothing but trouble. Small began life in Worcestershire, but joined the infantry at 18 and got stationed in India. Unfortunately, after an ill-timed swim in the Ganges, a crocodile took his leg.
You think it was the same crocodile who took that one guy's hand?
He's gonna sell them, and then he'll be making money hand over foot.
That joke was jawful. Are these jokes gonna get us a dislike?
I would hope that after years of putting up with my puns, my subscribers would be better than that, but probably. Anyway, his commanding officer puts in a good word for a job as a plantation supervisor shortly before the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and he ends up trying to help British forces maintain order, eventually hunkering down at Fort Agra, which Small describes as a very queer place, the queerest ever I was in, and I have been in some rum corners too.
Which back then, in this context, just meant strange. You have something of a double take every time you read that in a story this old.
Small is approached by two Sikhs who demand that he join them and their accomplice in murdering a servant of the Raja, who is transporting a fortune of jewels to the British for safekeeping until the rebellion blows over. With no other choice, he agrees to help them, and they hide the treasure for themselves, but once everything calms down, the murder is discovered, and the four of them are brought into custody and sentenced to prison time, which is where Small made the acquaintance of Major Sholto Sholto and Captain Morstan. Sholto, a degenerate gambler and a heap of debt, agrees to recover the treasure in exchange for Sholto springing Small and his Sikh friends out of prison. But as established earlier, Sholto double-crosses them, takes all the treasure for himself, and flees back to England. And from that day, Small had only one thing on his mind: revenge. In the intervening time, he met Tonga, and together they killed a guard and escaped so Small could exact his revenge. And as we covered the rest earlier, with Holmes' deduction being spot on. Sholto was dying, Small's presence was the nail in the coffin, and they stole the treasure from the house.
Yeah, Small confirms pretty much everything Holmes has theorized during this adventure, except for the fact that Small brought his own rope. That he didn't know.
And Holmes figured out that the butler was the one feeding information to Small, so Jones made exactly one correct arrest in this case all by himself.
Even then, it wasn't that impressive. The butler did it is the most cliche answer to a mystery in the history of the genre. I am not letting up. With the whole story told, Jones takes Small into custody, and Watson reveals to his friend that he is soon to be married to Mary Morstan. While Holmes certainly sees her as a fitting partner, he can't bring himself to congratulate the doctor, and it's easy to see why. When this whole crazy adventure wraps up, Watson gets a wife out of it, Jones gets all the credit, what's left for Holmes? Well, he tells us, as he stretched his long white hand up, "For me, there still remains the cocaine bottle."
The story is pretty great. I mean, it already has a leg up over A Study in Scarlet because it doesn't suddenly become a diatribe against Mormons halfway through, but it also pretty much just jumps into the action and doesn't waste any time. I appreciate that, especially with older material that can sometimes be very dense or hard to get into due to the differences in writing style and language between when it was written and the modern day, but I didn't really notice that problem here.
I definitely agree. The case is vastly intriguing, with a great sense of progression to the events as more information comes to light. That makes the case both stranger for us and more clear to our consulting detective. From a mysterious benefactor to a classic locked door murder to an action-packed boat chase, the pacing is excellent, especially for an older novel. There's never a dull moment. The atmosphere really sets the scenes, too. The descriptions of London make you feel like you're there, and the recounting of things like Bartholomew's body when it's discovered are truly chilling. It also helps that Jonathan Small's backstory is mercifully shorter than Jefferson Hope's. Like, thank God. That really made A Study in Scarlet drag for me back in the day. Everything about it improves on the first novel. A lot of the most iconic things about Sherlock Holmes and his legacy originated here. Some of his most well-remembered quotes are in this story, the introduction of most of his eccentric habits, well-known side characters like Jones, Toby, and Mary all came from this novel.
The characters are instantly recognizable as Holmes and Watson. While some other writers take some time to nail down the various idiosyncrasies of their characters, think about how many series and franchises have early installment weirdness, Doyle doesn't seem to have that problem, as both A Study in Scarlet and today's novel had them acting exactly as I'd expect, despite having nearly 2 centuries of stories and adaptations floating around in my head. They're the same dynamic duo that I've grown to love over the years. And even if we hate Anthony Jones, the fact that Doyle was able to go to such an extreme to make him such an unlikable character, to the fact that we riffed on him for a lot longer than I usually spend on characters I hate, speaks to a talent for creating interesting characters. And Mary, while this was a bit jarring for me since my only exposure to her previously was her characterization from the BBC Sherlock show, which is different, to say the least, was a neat addition and gave Watson a personal stake in the case, which worked out to make the narration very vivid and detailed. It also develops the minor characters pretty well. Mrs. Smith, wife of Mordecai, was pretty fleshed out for being just in the one scene. Same with the servants at the elder Sholto's home. And again, the book gets high marks for just having a dog in it, especially one that sounds adorable, even if his nose got confused.
Now that the introductions are out of the way, we have the time to flesh out the characters, especially our 2 leads, with Watson being more attached to his brilliant friend, showing concern for him without being afraid to criticize his comments or behavior. It's a great demonstration of how Watson can be both proactive and compliant. He can empathize with the needs of people around him and react accordingly, regardless if it serves his own interests. He even gets a love interest. Their connection is apparent right away, and there's actually more of Watson's inner monologue dedicated to to it than I remembered. There's a lot of sentimental thoughts towards Mary from Mr. Three Continents Watson, and love us or hate this, it is very sweet. Then there's Holmes. This is one of those stories that makes you understand why some people believe to this day that he was a living, breathing person. His characterization is so vast and well realized, exploring and presenting so many parts of who he is, from the amount of energy he gets from a case to how melancholy he can get with nothing to occupy himself with, his problems with drugs, his mistrust and apathy towards women and love, the value he sees in Watson's company, expanding on his methods and how he applies them. It's that wide range of traits that makes this character so iconic. This is also the story where we discover that Holmes has written several papers on niche areas of his own interests. Is it any wonder why I love this man so much?
I don't know if it's still a thing in later entries, since like I said, I'm reading these as I go, but I do like the idea of having the final chapter be mostly dedicated to the villain's backstory, in their own words, since it's an effective way of getting the story out without it feeling like exposition. And Jonathan Small's backstory is very... not endearing, but captivating in a way, because he really was a wronged party where Sholto was involved. Less so with the other murder, but Major Sholto got what was coming to him. It's just a shame that his son had to die for the sins of the father.
I only really have two issues with the Sign of Four. While I understand it's a product of its time, some of the descriptions about Tonga and his origins could make a modern audience uncomfortable. Understandably. Especially with descriptions like beastly and tales about acts of cannibalism. Conan Doyle was pretty fond of the Lost World genre that was slowly becoming a thing at this point in time, and if you've seen King Kong, you might know that genre was not very flattering of indigenous people. It could have been worse, but if I had to give this book a criticism, that would be it. The other criticism concerns Mary. Now, Mary is not bad in this story by any stretch. She's intuitive, considerate, and has a good eye for what could be relevant to solving her case. Holmes even calls her the model client. Unfortunately, despite being married to one of the leads, Mary more or less loses all of her active involvement from this point on, only speaking to allow her husband to go out with his best friend for the weekend, or being out of town when she'd be inconvenient for the plot until she dies off screen during the hiatus. Again, not a problem with this story per se, but one that does sort of affect it if you've read her future appearances.
And I agree with Kate. Much like most of the writing of the time, outside of some funny moments of archaic language, a lot of the racially insensitive elements can take you out of the story, as are the mentions of these savages that permeate through the second half of the book. Not to mention pretty much everything that Small says in his backstory is tinged with racism, given that it glorifies British colonial rule of India, but if you can look past them, it's still a decent story.
Really, neither of those negatives does enough to make The Sign of Four any less fantastic. My journey with Sherlock Holmes began when I read A Study in Scarlet one summer in high school, and while that is a great story in its own right, and one I think we need to appreciate more, checking out the Literary Lair episode on it would be a great start, reading through this book immediately after is where I think I fell in love with Sherlock Holmes. So much about what I love about Sherlock Holmes and his cases came from this story. Thankfully, despite what Watson claims at the end of this story, this would not be the end of their adventures, not by a long shot. For me, and I'd imagine many other readers, it was only the beginning.
I'm very much an adaptational fan of Holmes, since most of my favorite Holmes stories are adaptations. Elementary, the Star Trek episodes with Moriarty, even Sherlock and the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies, so this is my first exposure to the stories. If I haven't done a video on it, I've never read it before, and going in blind as I did, only knowing stray things here and there, it's a very effective story. I like the pacing. Like I said, some older books can be dense and hard to get into, but I didn't have that problem with this one, and as the case really got going, I was on the edge of my seat, wondering what was going to happen next. Even if I feel like that whole bit of meet with Sholto's agent, travel to Sholto's house, hear the story, then travel to the other Sholto's house was a bit of a long journey to get to a murder. It manages to keep the excitement going as we get the small kernels here and there as Thaddeus's manic energy manifests on the pages. And that was The Sign of the Four, a wholly enjoyable Sherlock Holmes story that manages to surpass its predecessor in practically every way. And while I like A Study in Scarlet fine enough, I think this would be a better entry point to the series. Besides, you never start with the pilot anyway. You always wait until they find their footing, and Doyle found his footing pretty quickly.
This is one of the most adapted Sherlock Holmes stories out there for a reason. It's one of those stories that's so exciting, it's worth telling over and over again. As great as the other 3 novels for Sherlock Holmes are, this is the one I'd recommend if you want to check out one of the original novels and see why these stories are loved and read even to this day.
On that, we're in complete agreement. Well, I think that about wraps up the case.
Yeah, although technically this wasn't much of a case. We didn't really solve anything, we just talked about the novel for like 20 minutes.
Semantics, my dear Watson.
Well, this has been an extraordinary experience nonetheless. Call me if you ever cover Hound of the Baskervilles.
Will do. But until then... Weird. I wasn't expecting visitors. A letter? Huh. Let's see what this is about. My word! The Queen's prize corgi Good Charles was stolen. It's up to us to solve the case.
You do know we're not real detectives, right?
Tell that to my hat. Come, Watson, the game is afoot.
But, what the hell. Internet reviewers have been on crazier adventures. Right behind you, Holmes.
See you all next time. Time to do my Howard Cosell impression.
Though I did do a year-long dedicated retrospective to this particular adaptation. You don't have to put that in there if you don't want to, Mike. I just can't help plugging that series.
My word! The Queen's prize corgi Good Charles was stolen. It's us to us. It's us to up to... Kitla predicts. I feel like Johnny Carson. Kitla predicts.